This is the 1853 Steamboat Arabia. Well, kind of. I'm Darren, and this is the Industrial Revolution. The Arabia is almost certainly most famous for having completely vanished for more than a century, and especially for where she was eventually found. We'll definitely be getting to that fascinating aspect of her history in a bit, but really, first and foremost, Arabia was a typical working 19th century riverboat, and even as a working riverboat, she had a pretty amazing career. Built in West Brownsville, Pennsylvania, about 60 miles, 100 kilometers south of Pittsburgh, just down the Monongahela River, Arabia was built by John S. Pringle and the Pringle Boatbuilding Company. She cost $20,000 at the time, or about $870,000 in today's dollars. Pringle, a prominent 19th century boatyard, produced hundreds of riverboats for America's rivers. And yes, I said boatyard, not shipyard. Technically, ships are larger, deep-water vessels, well suited to open water, while boats are smaller, shallow-water vessels, better suited for smaller lakes and rivers. Before they were canalized, by dredging and adding dams and locks, inland rivers had a lot of really shallow areas, sandbars, and mud banks, and they were often only a few feet deep, if that. Because of that, American riverboats were built to operate in extremely shallow water. They were built with flat-bottomed hulls and a draft of only 3 or 4 feet, or about a meter, when fully loaded to capacity. Arabia was a fairly typical riverboat at 171 feet, or 52 meters long, and 29 feet, or 8.8 meters wide. At the bottom was the cargo hold. At less than 5 feet high, this ran the entire bottom of the flat-bottomed riverboat. To fit in the cargo, it was packed full. When a Missouri riverboat left St. Louis, it was packed tight, front to back, side to side, top to bottom. We'll see just how packed they were a little later. Above the cargo hold, and sitting just a couple feet above the water, was the main deck. Unlike larger ships, riverboats kept their boilers and steam engines up on the main deck, along with a few cords of firewood behind the boilers, and any extra cargo they could stack up there. Also on the main deck were the deck passengers. These were the cheap tickets. If you're a fan of Titanic movies, you might have heard them called the steerage, but it wasn't really so elegant as that. If you were traveling only a few hours, it wouldn't be so bad, and in good weather, this was probably how most people would actually prefer to travel. For a long trip, though, it was a completely different story. Deck passengers had a roof over their head from the deck above, but no sidewalls. There were no beds, no cabins, and no food service. You'd have a single shared stove to keep warm and cook, shared with all the other deck passengers. At night, you'd try to find some place to curl up on the deck to sleep, hopefully out of the weather. For food, if you wanted to eat, you had to bring your own. You could also jump off the boat at the riverside towns to either buy or scavenge what you could find when the boat stopped for wood. Travel as a deck passenger wasn't comfortable, but then again, neither was walking hundreds of miles. What you didn't do as a deck passenger was go upstairs. If you had money, you'd move up to the next deck, strangely called the boiler deck. I say strangely because the boilers were not actually on the boiler deck, they were down on the main deck. The boiler deck got its name because it was directly above the boilers and could, potentially, get pretty hot, or maybe just stay comfortably warm depending on the weather. The boiler deck was home to the cabin class passengers' staterooms. Cabin class was essentially first class. Their tickets were all inclusive, typically including 3 high-end meals in the dining saloon each day, plus other amenities provided by the riverboat. Popular mythology says that instead of painting cabin numbers on the doors here, they'd paint the names of states, hence the name stateroom. It's a great story, but Arabia, a relatively modest-sized riverboat at the time, had 50 passenger staterooms. The country at the time had only 31 states. Above the boiler deck was the hurricane deck. This mostly open-air deck was reserved for cabin-class passengers and crew only. It provided a place for these first-class passengers to relax in the fresh air, to promenade on the deck, and to watch the river go by in comfort. At the front of the hurricane deck was a smaller structure called the Texas. First added to riverboats around 1845, and only to the largest riverboats at the time, the Texas got its name from the newest and largest state at the time. On Arabia, the Texas contained 10 shared staterooms reserved for the captain and crew. Above the Texas was the glass-enclosed pilot house. The pilot house was home to the ship's wheel, which directly controls the rudder, as well as levers to control a series of bells down on the main deck. Today, we're all used to seeing the ship's telegraph or chadburn on the bridge to send signals to the engine room, but that wasn't around yet. Instead, they'd use 3 different bells. They had a big, deep-sounding bell called the glong bell, which signaled forward and backward movement. There was a small, higher-pitched bell called the jingler, and that signaled if the captain wanted to either speed up or slow down. Finally, there was a mid-sized, rather flat-sounding bell called the shifting bell. The shifting bell signaled to engage or disengage the paddle wheels. This cowbell-like bell essentially told the engineers to shift the boat into neutral, letting the paddle wheels spin freely, or put it in gear and actually engage the paddle wheels. With major rivers like the Ohio, Mississippi, and Missouri rivers, combined with the rapidly expanding canal networks, especially in states like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, you could quickly and easily travel or ship cargo throughout the U.S. and U.S. territories. By the mid-19th century, railroads were getting a solid start, but everyone already knew, just by looking at a map, that water transportation was the real future. Just don't tell the railroads. In late summer 1853, the Arabia slid into the muddy water of the Monongahela River. Arabia was just another riverboat, one of hundreds coming out of the boatyards in the area every year. Built of unseasoned green timber to save money, it was all about building them cheap and fast. The life of a riverboat was a tough one, with the average Missouri River riverboat lasting only about 4 or 5 years. The new owners hoped should give them half a dozen years of service, if they were lucky, and then should be forever forgotten. Except, of course, she didn't actually last that long, and she definitely was not forgotten. Arabia, like so many before her, began life as a packet boat, doing mixed passenger freight service. With the ability to comfortably handle over 100 passengers and 200 tons of cargo, the beautiful sidewheeler plied the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. With a maximum upriver speed of about 5 miles or 8 kilometers per hour, it may not seem fast to us today, but this was high speed and high luxury travel at the time. Remember, there were no planes, no trains, no motor cars, and not many luxuries in travel. If you weren't on a riverboat, you were probably on foot. She was propelled by a pair of 600 horsepower, independently operating AT Merritt steam engines. Each engine contained a single, double-acting cylinder with a 22-inch, 56-centimeter bore with a 6-foot, 1.8-meter stroke. These engines took a lot of steam at an incredibly high pressure for the time, 100 psi, and that came from this set of 3 Western Rivers 2-flue boilers. You'd think that each of these would operate independently, and that'd probably make sense. Instead, all 3 were actually linked and had to operate simultaneously. Across the top of the boilers was a pipe called the steam drum. It connected the 3 boilers to the engines on each side. Across the bottom, the large pipe is called the mud drum. Muddy river water was pumped into this pipe and flowed into the boilers to be boiled for power. Of course, that created a whole other problem. We'll come to that. Riverboats like Arabia were fueled mostly with wood, up to 30 full cords of wood a day, but they'd also keep a little high-energy coal handy, just in case they needed to supercharge the boiler for a quick boost of energy. Of course, with a single cord of fresh-cut wood weighing a couple of tons, they couldn't actually carry all that wood, so locals would harvest it from the riverbanks to sell to passing riverboats. Arabia, like her sister riverboats, would need to stop every few hours or so for fuel, not unlike steam trains stopping for coal along the route, really. That very wood harvest, though, killed the riverbank vegetation, opening it up to erosion. The erosion washed out the tree stumps, creating what were called snags. If you're a riverboat, snags are bad. In the case of Arabia, snags are very bad. If you know steam locomotives, you already know what's coming. Steam trains tried to operate with one simple rule. If you wouldn't drink it, don't put it into the boiler. Unfortunately for trains, sometimes that didn't work out. But for riverboats on the notoriously muddy Missouri and Mississippi rivers, it never worked out. All they had was mud. As you pump in muddy water, the water boils away, leaving the dirt, muck, fish, whatever in the boiler. Pump in more muddy water, you've got more gunk. The worse the water, the faster it builds up. Eventually, it creates problems, and there's only one way to solve it. Just like a locomotive, engineers would open a valve in the mud pipe, which blasts superheated water at full boiler pressure out through the mud pipe and out the side of the boat, taking all the gunk out with it. On a river like the Ohio River, with fairly clean water, you might need to do this only a couple times a day. With the Missouri River, which was said to be too thick to drink and too thin to plow, this process, called a blowdown, was something you'd actually need to do every hour or two. With the long mud pipe and interconnected boilers, you couldn't just open the valve, close it, and be done. Instead, the engineer would actually open the valve for a few seconds, close it briefly, open another few seconds, close it again, open it one more time, just for a few seconds, and then close it. This served two purposes. First, it prevented the boiler pressure from dropping too suddenly, but also it helped break up the mud in the mud drum. These huge 24-foot, 7 1/3 meter long boilers provided steam to the two steam engines, which powered the even more huge 28-foot, 8.5 meter diameter paddle wheels. They were 8 feet, about 2.5 meters wide, and could run at about 15 to 20 RPM. Here, since they're not really in any hurry to move this museum building along with this rebuilt paddle wheel, the rebuilt one here is running only about 2 to 3 RPM. So in reality, it could run 5, even 10 times this speed. If we take a closer look at this recovered paddle wheel hub, also called a flange, you can see where the radial arms were set into the iron hub. You can also see the huge iron crank that connected, via the pitman arm, to the steam engine. There's one of these on each side of the boat. Look at how solid this is built, but it had to be. This hub had to take the full force of the engine against the river water below. In February 1855, after about a year and a half of service on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, the Arabia was purchased by Captain John Shaw. It was to serve on the much tougher Missouri River route, going from St. Louis upriver to St. Joseph, or as far as anyone would pay them to go. As it turns out, the Army and fur traders were both willing to pay for a long, long trip. In early June 1855, the Arabia joined a 6-boat expeditionary fleet and began what was to be her longest journey ever. Loading up with supplies in St. Louis, she steamed up the Missouri River to Fort Leavenworth in what would later become the state of Kansas. At Fort Leavenworth, 109 Army soldiers, their equipment and supplies, all under the command of General William S. Harney, boarded Arabia, which then continued upriver. Dropping the soldiers and their equipment at Fort Pierre, which later became Pierre, South Dakota, the 600 total soldiers were part of the 1855 Sioux expedition, culminating in the Battle of Ash Hollow, where the tragic loss or heroic campaign depends on which side you were on. In any case, as the Army soldiers bravely marched away to their fate, some of the boats headed back downriver, but Arabia continued upriver, with her hold full of supplies for the American Fur Company in Fort Union. Located at the mouth of the Yellowstone River, on the modern border of North Dakota and Montana, Fort Union was nearly as far as you could push a riverboat. For 2 decades, the American Fur Company, which operated Fort Union, had paid a brave riverboat crew to make the trip one and only one time a year. By 1855, though, business had exploded, so now they were paying 2 or even 3 riverboats a year to make the trip. Arabia reached Fort Union on August 14, 1855. Upon arrival, she unloaded a cargo of trade goods and a year of supplies for the remote trading post. With the wind, or rather current, at her back, Arabia set off back to St. Louis with a total round-trip distance of nearly 4,000 miles or 6,400 kilometers on the epic 3-month journey. Upon her return to St. Louis, Arabia continued her career on the lower Missouri River as a typical packet boat, running between St. Louis, St. Joseph, Missouri, and Omaha, Nebraska. She carried countless passengers and untold tons of cargo along the river. Everything was smooth sailing, so to speak, until March 1856. With new owners, again, Arabia continued her packet boat duties on the Missouri River, but quickly hit some type of underwater obstacle, either a sandbar or rock, no one's quite sure, and severely damaged the rudder and almost sank. After limping back to Portland for emergency structural repairs, she returned to service. Briefly. On March 12, 1856, pro-slavery border ruffians raided the Arabia near Lexington, Missouri. Acting on a tip, they were looking for weapons being smuggled to abolitionist forces. They discovered and seized 100 Sharps rifles and 2 cannons hidden in boxes labeled as carpenter's tools. Taking the weapons and the abolitionist leader David Starr Hoyt, they then forced the Arabia, with over 100 passengers on board, to untie from the dock and leave. March was shaping up to be a rough month for the new owners. Just a couple weeks after hitting the sandbar, and soon after the border ruffians' raid, a cylinder head blew, disabling one engine. Fortunately, it was repairable, and she continued on her journey. With such a rough month, things surely couldn't get any worse. Could they? Hey, I just want to take a second to thank my channel members here, along with all of the Super Thanks supporters. All these people, they make it possible to run this channel. If you want to join in and help out, channel members, whether at patreon.com/industrialrevolution or here on YouTube, every month you get an update on what's going on with the channel. And also, I've just started doing insider videos for channel members. That can be, scouting trips or video that just didn't fit for whatever reason into the main video, or talk about what's going on in the area, or just about anything. So if you want to get in on that, just jump over to patreon.com/industrialrevolution, or you can become a member here on YouTube. Thanks a lot for your support, and let's get back to the video. On August 30th, 1856, Arabia left St. Louis on a typical journey upriver. She carried about 130 passengers, around 30 crew members, and 200 tons of cargo. On the afternoon of September 5th, 1856, Arabia snuck a snag in the river on Quindaro Bend, near Parkville, Missouri. One of the trees cut to fuel passing riverboats, possibly to fuel Arabia herself, had eroded away from the shore and fatally ruptured the hull. Arabia was doomed. The engineers, keeping their heads as water poured into the hull, dumped pressure and a huge roar of steam, knowing that failing to do so would instantly explode the boilers as soon as they sank to the river level. The impact on the snag was so great that some passengers were thrown to the deck. Add in the deafening roar of dumping the boilers, and passengers were pretty fearful, but with the boat not plunging to the depths, it was actually just sitting on the muddy river bottom, passengers instead experienced more of a slowly growing anxiety. Waiting on the top hurricane deck, 130 passengers and crew waited while the single small rowboat ferried people from the boat to the shore just a few at a time. All passengers were safely evacuated, except for one mule in the cargo hold, rumored to be forgotten. The reality is that the mule was so panicked that, despite efforts to free him, he couldn't be safely removed. Eventually, he went down with the ship, and Arabia sank. Very, very slowly. So slowly, in fact, that many thought she wasn't going to sink at all. They just left her there for the night, planning to come back in the morning to salvage the cargo. By morning, when salvage teams returned, Arabia had sunk into the mud. Only the stack and the wheelhouse were left above water, and even that was gone soon after. Arabia was quickly forgotten. Riverboats, especially on the Missouri River, sank like this all the time. There were hundreds of them, and including other major American rivers, thousands. Arabia sank with no loss of passengers or crew, but that didn't mean it wasn't a tragedy. Upriver, 16 frontier towns, with their entire winter supply of winter coats, boots, and other supplies, lost everything. These riverboats were Amazon and UPS and Walmart and everything else. These towns were in for a hard winter. Just how hard? Let's take a look at what they lost. The amount of cargo salvaged from Arabia is honestly just astounding. And there's just too much. I can't actually even show it all in this video. And that's only maybe half of what was actually salvaged. I had the opportunity to speak briefly with Jerry McKee, one of the people who discovered and excavated Arabia. And we talked briefly about just how much of the collection, how much of the cargo is still left. So all this stuff here, what percentage of the cargo is displayed?
Depends. If it's dishes, it's mostly done. If it's fabrics, that fabric cases down there, that's 5%.
That's all?
That's all, yeah. Now, we've got a lot more of it clean, but we rotate it because fabric doesn't like to sit out in the light real well.
Yeah.
But we have years of sewing clothes together yet. The fabric lady that works down there was telling me the other day, she's 8 to 10 years probably away from it and done. And then the boots and shoes on display, I'd say that's about a third. Yeah. We found 4,000 of them. And I know we've still got 800 or 900 in frozen ice blocks yet. We haven't even taken out, started working on.
What about like the metal stuff? I saw like metal tools, hinges.
I could probably do another display, kind of like we've got where the hardware is down there, where the doorknobs and hinges. That's probably about half. I got a lot of that stored.
Yeah.
Panels, pieces of glass. Well, I got a lot of that stored. There's boxes of them though. Back in the hardware, there's glass plates or there's glass for window glass. They're stacked up in boxes. There's a gob of them, and then the windows on the general store are all glass off the boat. I got more of that stored here and there. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. Yeah. I've got stuff in storage that would fit another museum.
Over the years, the Missouri River moved a half-mile away, but Arabia remained until in the late 1980s when she was found and excavated. The story of that discovery and excavation is what got me interested in Arabia, and is why I drove 1,500 miles, 2,400 kilometers to see it. But I'll leave that story to the people who found her, and I'll link that video in the description. So the Arabia only lasted for 3 years. It's shorter than the 5-year average lifespan for steamboats on the Missouri River here. And then on September of 1856, it struck this snag, ruptured the hull, and quickly sank. Fortunately, much of it, as you've seen in this video, has been salvaged, is available today, at least through November when the museum is scheduled to close due to needing a new location. Hopefully they find one soon and it reopens, but whether they do or not, this is the Industrial Revolution. Hey, thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. You can really help us out by like, share, and subscribe. Subscribe over here. And that really helps out. And comment. I love reading your comments, and I usually respond pretty quick. If you want to see more videos on the Industrial Revolution, click the playlist over here, or the one up here that YouTube thinks you'll really enjoy next. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.